Chapter 25 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Father Ziley. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 25. The Games. The great dance was not to begin until 8 o'clock, but for any lads and lasses who liked to dance on the shady grass before then, there was music always at hand. For was not the band of the Benefit Club capable of playing excellent jigs, reels, and hornpipes? And besides this, there was a grand band hired from Rossiter, who with their wonderful wind instruments and puffed-out cheeks were themselves a delightful show to the small boys and girls. To say nothing of Joshua Rann's fiddle, which, by an act of generous forethought, he had provided himself with, in case any one should be of sufficiently pure taste to prefer dancing to a solo on that instrument. Meantime, when the sun had moved off the great open space in front of the house, the games began. There were, of course, well-soaped poles to be climbed by the boys and youths, races to be run by the old women, races to be run in sacks, heavy weights to be lifted by the strong men, and a long list of challenges to such ambitious attempts as that of walking as many yards as possible on one leg, feats in which it was generally remarked that Wiry Ben, being the lissomest, springest fellow in the country, was sure to be preeminent. To crown all, there was to be a donkey race, that sublimest of all races, conducted on the grand socialistic idea of everybody encouraging everybody else's donkey, and the sorriest donkey winning. And soon after 4 o'clock, splendid old Mrs. Irwin, in her damask satin and jewels and black lace, was led out by Arthur, followed by the whole family party, to her raised seat under the striped marquee, where she was to give out the prizes to the victors. Staid, formal Miss Lydia had requested to resign that queenly office to the royal old lady, and Arthur was pleased with this opportunity of gratifying his godmother's taste for stateliness. Old Mr. Donnithorne, the delicately clean, finely scented, withered old man, led out Miss Irwin with his air of punctilious acid politeness. Mr. Gawain brought Miss Lydia, looking neutral and stiff in an elegant peach-blossom silk, and Mr. Irwin came last with his pale sister Anne. No other friend of the family, besides Mr. Gawain, was invited today. There was to be a grand dinner for the neighboring gentry on the morrow, but today all the forces were required for the entertainment of the tenants. There was a sunk fence in front of the marquee, dividing the lawn from the park, but a temporary bridge had been made for the passage of the victors, and the groups of people standing or seated here and there on benches stretched on each side of the open space from the white marquees up to the sunk fence. "Upon my word, it's a pretty sight," said the old lady in her deep voice, when she was seated, and looked round on the bright scene with its dark green background. "And it's the last fête day I'm likely to see, unless you make haste and get married, Arthur. But take care you get a charming bride, else I would rather die without seeing her." "You're so terribly fastidious, godmother," said Arthur. "I'm afraid I should never satisfy you with my choice." "Well, I won't forgive you if she's not handsome. I can't be put off with amiability, which is always the excuse people are making for the existence of plain people, and she must not be silly. That will never do, because you'll want managing, and a silly woman can't manage you. Who is that tall young man, Dauphin, with the mild face? There, standing without his hat, and taking such care of that tall old woman by the side of him. His mother, of course. I like to see that." "What? Don't you know him, mother?" asked Mr. Irwin. "That is Seth Bede, Adam's brother, a Methodist, but a very good fellow. Poor Seth has looked rather downhearted of late. I thought it was because of his father's dying in that sad way, but Joshua Rand tells me he wanted to marry that sweet little Methodist preacher who was here about a month ago, and I suppose she refused him."
"Ah, I remember hearing about her. But there are no end of people here that I don't know, for they're grown up and altered so since I used to go about."
"What excellent sight you have," said old Mr. Donnithorne, who was holding a double glass up to his eyes, "to see the expression of that young man's face so far off. His face is nothing but a pale blurred spot to me, but I fancy I have the advantage of you when we come to look close. I can read small print without spectacles."
"Ah, my dear sir, you began with being very near-sighted, and those near-sighted eyes always wear the best. I want very strong spectacles to read with, but then I think my eyes get better and better for things at a distance. I suppose if I could live another 50 years I should be blind to everything that wasn't out of other people's sight, like a man who stands at a well and sees nothing but the stars."
"See," said Arthur, "the old women are ready to set out on their race now. Which do you bet on, Gwaine?" "The long-legged one, unless they're going to have several heats, and then the little wiry one may win."
"There are the Poysers, mother, not far off on the right hand," said Miss Irwin. "Mrs. Poyser is looking at you. Do take notice of her."
"To be sure I will,"
said the old lady, giving a gracious bow to Mrs. Poyser.
"A woman who sends me such excellent cream cheese is not to be neglected. Bless me, what a fat child that is she is holding on her knee! But who is that pretty girl with dark eyes?"
"That is Hetty Sorrel," said Miss Lydia Donnithorne, "Martin Poyser's niece. A very likely young person, and well-looking too. My maid has taught her fine needlework, and she has mended some lace of mine very respectably indeed, very respectably." "Why, she has lived with the Poysers 6 or 7 years, mother. You must have seen her," said Miss Irwin.
"No, I've never seen her, child, at least not as she is now,"
said Mrs. Irwin, continuing to look at Hetty.
"Well looking indeed. She's a perfect beauty. I've never seen anything so pretty since my young days. What a pity such beauty as that should be thrown away among the farmers, when it's wanted so terribly among the good families without fortune. I dare say now she'll marry a man who would have thought her just as pretty if she had round eyes and red hair."
Arthur dared not turn his eyes towards Hetty while Mrs. Irwin was speaking of her. He feigned not to hear, and to be occupied with something on the opposite side, but he saw her plainly enough without looking, saw her in heightened beauty, because he heard her beauty praised. For other men's opinion, you know, was like a native climate to Arthur's feelings. It was the air on which they thrived the best, and grew strong. Yes, she was enough to turn any man's head, and any man in his place would have done and felt the same, and to give her up after all, as he was determined to do, would be an act that he should always look back upon with pride.
"No, mother,"
And Mr. Irwin, replying to her last words, "I can't agree with you there. The common people are not quite so stupid as you imagine. The commonest man who has his ounce of sense and feeling is conscious of the difference between a lovely, delicate woman and a coarse one. Even a dog feels a difference in their presence. The man may be no better able than the dog to explain the influence the more refined beauty has on him, but he feels it."
"Bless me, Dauphin, what does an old bachelor like you know about it?"
"Oh, that is one of the matters in which old bachelors are wiser than married men, because they have time for more general contemplation. Your fine critic of woman must never shackle his judgment by calling one woman his own. But as an example of what I was saying, that pretty Methodist preacher I mentioned just now told me that she had preached to the roughest miners, and had never been treated with anything but the utmost respect and kindness by them. The reason is, though she doesn't know it, that there's so much tenderness, refinement, and purity about her. Such a woman as that brings with her airs from heaven that the coarsest fellow is not insensible to."
"Here's a delicate bit of womanhood or girlhood coming to receive a prize, I suppose," said Mr. Gawaine. "She must be one of the racers in the sacks who had set off before we came." The bit of womanhood was our old acquaintance Bessie Cranage, otherwise Chad's Bess, whose large red cheeks and blousy person had undergone an exaggeration of colour, which, if she had happened to be a heavenly body, would have made her sublime. Bessie, I am sorry to say, had taken to her earrings again since Dinah's departure, and was otherwise decked out in such small finery as she could muster. Any one who could have looked into poor Bessie's heart would have seen a striking resemblance between her little hopes and anxieties and Hetty's. The advantage, perhaps, would have been on Bessie's side in the matter of feeling. But then, you'll see, they were so very different outside. You would have been inclined to box Bessie's ears, and you would have longed to kiss Hetty. Bessie had been tempted to run the arduous race, partly from mere heathenish gaiety, partly because of the prize. Some one had said there were to be cloaks and other nice clothes for prizes, and she approached the marquee, fanning herself with her handkerchief, but with exultation sparkling in her round eyes. "Here is the prize for the first sack race," said Miss Lydia, taking a large parcel from the table where the prizes were laid, and giving it to Mrs. Irwine before Bessie came up. "An excellent grogram gown and a piece of flannel." "You didn't think the winner was to be so young, I suppose, aunt?" said Arthur. "Couldn't you find something else for this girl, and save that grim-looking gown for one of the older women?" "I have bought nothing but what is useful and substantial," said Miss Lydia, adjusting her own lace. "I should not think of encouraging a love of finery in young women of that class. I have a scarlet cloak, but that is for the old woman who wins." This speech of Miss Lydia's produced rather a mocking expression in Mrs. Irwine's face as she looked at Arthur, while Bessie came up and dropped a series of curtsies. "This is Bessie Cranage, mother," said Mr. Irwine kindly, "Chad Cranage's daughter. You remember Chad Cranage, the blacksmith?" "Yes, to be sure," said Mrs. Irwine. "Well, Bessie, here is your prize. Excellent warm things for winter. I'm sure you have had hard work to win them this warm day." Betsy's lip fell as she saw the ugly, heavy gown, which felt so hot and disagreeable too on this July day, and was such a great ugly thing to carry. She dropped her curtsies again without looking up, and with a growing tremulousness about the corners of her mouth, and then turned away. "Poor girl," said Arthur. "I think she's disappointed. I wish it had been something more to her taste." "She's a bold-looking young person," observed Miss Lydia, "not at all one I should like to encourage." Arthur silently resolved that he would make Bessie a present of money before the day was over, that she might buy something more to her mind. But she, not aware of the consolation in store for her, turned out of the open space where she was visible from the marquee, and throwing down the odious bundle under a tree, began to cry, very much tittered at the while by the small boys. In this situation she was descried by her discreet matronly cousin, who lost no time in coming up, having just given the baby into her husband's charge. "What's the matter with ye?" said Bess the matron, taking up the bundle and examining it. "Ye'n sweltered yourseln, I reckon, running that fool's race. And here they'n gin you lots o' good grogram and flannel, as should ha' been gin by good rights to them as had the sense to keep away from such foolery. You might spare me a bit o' this grogram to make clothes for the lad. You are ne'er ill-natured, Bess. I ne'er said that on ye." "You may take it all for what I care," said Bess the maiden, with a pettish movement, beginning to wipe away her tears and recover herself. "Well, I could do it, if be ye want to get rid on't," said the disinterested cousin, walking quickly away with the bundle, lest Chad's niece should change her mind. But that bony-cheeked lass was blessed with an elasticity of spirits that secured her from any rankling grief, and by the time the grand climax of the donkey race came on, her disappointment was entirely lost in the delightful excitement of attempting to stimulate the last donkey by hisses, while the boys applied the argument of sticks. But the strength of the donkey mind lies in adopting a course inversely as the arguments urged, which, well considered, requires as great a mental force as the direct sequence. And the present donkey proved the first-rate order of his intelligence by coming to a dead standstill just when the blows were thickest. Great was the shouting of the crowd, radiant the grinning of Bill Downs, the stone sawyer, and the fortunate rider of this superior beast, which stood calm and stiff-legged in the midst of its triumph. Arthur himself had provided the prizes for the men, and Bill was made happy with a splendid pocket-knife, supplied with blades and gimlets enough to make a man at home on a desert island. He had hardly returned from the marquee with the prize in his hand when it began to be understood that Wiry Ben proposed to amuse the company, before the gentry went to dinner, with an impromptu and gratuitous performance, namely a hornpipe, the main idea of which was doubtless borrowed, but this was to be developed by the dancer in so peculiar and complex a manner that no one could deny him the praise of originality. Wiry Ben's pride in his dancing, an accomplishment productive of great effect at the yearly wake, had needed only slightly elevating by an extra quantity of good ale to convince him that the gentry would be very much struck with his performance of his hornpipe. And he had been decidedly encouraged in this idea by Joshua Rann, who observed that it was nothing but right to do something to please the young squire, in return for what he had done for them. You will be the less surprised at this opinion in so grave a personage when you learn that Ben had requested Mr. Rann to accompany him on the fiddle, and Joshua felt quite sure that though there might not be much in the dancing, the music would make up for it. Adam Bede, who was present in one of the large marquees where the plan was being discussed, told Ben he had better not make a fool of himself, a remark which at once fixed Ben's determination. He was not going to let anything alone because Adam and Bede turned up his nose at it. "What's this? What's this?" said old Mr. Donnithorne. "Is something you've arranged with Arthur? Here's the clerk coming with his fiddle, and a smart fellow with a nosegay in his buttonhole." "No," said Arthur, "I know nothing about it. By Jove, he's going to dance. It's one of the carpenters. I forget his name at this moment." "It's Ben Carnage, Wiry Ben, they call him," said Mr. Irwine. "Rather a loose fish, I think. Anne, my dear, I see that fiddle scraping is too much for you. You're getting tired. Let me take you in now, that you may rest till dinner." Miss Anne rose assentingly, and the good brother took her away, while Joshua's preliminary scrapings burst into the white cockade, from which he intended to pass to a variety of tunes by a series of transitions which his good ear really taught him to execute with some skill. It would have been an exasperating fact to him, if he had known it, that the general attention was too thoroughly absorbed by Ben's dancing for any one to give much heed to the music. Have you ever seen a real English rustic perform a solo dance? Perhaps you have only seen a ballet rustic, smiling like a merry countryman in crockery, with graceful turns of the haunch and insinuating movements of the head. That is as much like the real thing as the bird waltz is like the song of birds. Wiry Ben never smiled. He looked as serious as a dancing monkey, as serious as if he had been an experimental philosopher ascertaining in his own person the amount of shaking and the varieties of angularity that could be given to the human limbs. To make amends for the abundant laughter in the striped marquee, Arthur clapped his hands continually and cried, "Bravo!" But Ben had one admirer whose eyes followed his movements with a fervid gravity that equaled his own. It was Martin Poyser, who was seated on a bench with Tommy between his legs. "What dost think o' that?" he said to his wife. "He goes as pat to the music as if he was made o' clockwork. I used to be a pretty good un at dancing myself when I was lighter, but I could never ha' hit it just to the air like that." "It's little matter what his limbs are, to my thinking," returned Mrs. Poyser. "He's empty enough in the upper story.
or he'd never come jigging on, stamping in that way, like a mad grasshopper, for the gentry to look at him. They're fit to die with laughing, I can see." "Well, well, so much the better. It amuses 'em," said Mr. Poyser, who did not easily take an irritable view of things. "But they're going away now to have their dinner, I reckon. We'll move about a bit, shall we, and see what Adam Bede's doing. He's got to look after the drinking and things. I doubt he hasna had much fun."
End of chapter 25. Recording by Father Zeile, Detroit, Michigan, December 2008. DRZEILE.net. Chapter 26. The Dance of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Father Zeile of Detroit. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 26 of Book 3, The Dance. Arthur had chosen the entrance hall for the ballroom, very wisely, for no other room could have been so airy, or would have had the advantage of the wide doors opening into the garden, as well as a ready entrance into the other rooms. To be sure, a stone floor was not the pleasantest to dance on, but then most of the dancers had known what it was to enjoy a Christmas dance on kitchen quarries. It was one of those entrance halls which makes the surrounding rooms look like closets, with stucco angels, trumpets, and flower wreaths on the lofty ceiling, and great medallions of miscellaneous heroes on the walls, alternating with statues in niches. Just the sort of place to be ornamented well with green boughs, and Mr. Craig had been proud to show his taste and his hot-house plants on the occasion. The broad steps of the stone staircase were covered with cushions to serve as seats for the children, who were to stay till 9:30 with the servant-maids to see the dancing, and as this dance was confined to the chief tenants, there was abundant room for everyone. The lights were charmingly disposed in coloured paper lamps, high up among the green boughs, and the farmers' wives and daughters, as they peeped in, believed no scene could be more splendid. They knew now quite well in what sort of rooms the king and queen lived, and their thoughts glanced with some pity towards cousins and acquaintances who had not this fine opportunity of knowing how things went on in the great world. The lamps were already lit, though the sun had not long set, and there was that calm light out of the doors in which we seem to see all objects more distinctly than in the broad day. It was a pretty scene outside the house. The farmers and their families were moving about the lawn, among the flowers and shrubs, or along the broad straight road leading from the east front, where a carpet of mossy grass spread on each side, studded here and there with a dark flat-boughed cedar, or a grand pyramidal fir sweeping the ground with its branches, all tipped with a fringe of paler green. The groups of cottagers in the park were gradually diminishing, the young ones being attracted towards the lights that were beginning to gleam from the windows of the gallery in the abbey, which was to be their dancing-room, and some of the sober elder ones thinking it time to go home quietly. One of these was Lisbeth Bede, and Seth went with her, not from filial attention only, for his conscience would not let him join in dancing. It had been rather a melancholy day to Seth. Dinah had never been more constantly present with him than in this scene, where everything was so unlike her. He saw her all the more vividly after looking at the thoughtless faces and gay-colored dresses of the young women, just as one feels the beauty and the greatness of a pictured Madonna the more when it has been for a moment screened from us by a vulgar head in a bonnet. But this presence of Dinah in his mind only helped him to bear the better with his mother's mood, which had been becoming more and more querulous for the last hour. Poor Lisbeth was suffering from a strange conflict of feelings. Her joy and pride in the honor paid to her darling son Adam was beginning to be worsted in the conflict with the jealousy and fretfulness which had revived when Adam came to tell her that Captain Donnithorne desired him to join the dancers in the hall. Adam was getting more and more out of her reach. She wished all the old troubles back again, for then it mattered more to Adam what his mother said and did.
It's fine talking o' dancing," she said, "and thy father not a 5 week in his grave, and I wish I war there too, instead o' being left to take up merrier folks' room above ground."
"Nay, don't look at it in that way, mother," said Adam, who was determined to be gentle to her to-day. "I don't mean to dance. I shall only look on, and since the captain wishes me to be there, it'd look as if I thought I knew better than him to say as I'd rather not stay, and thee knowst how he's behaved to me to-day."
Thee't do as thee lik'st, for th' old mother's got no right to hinder thee. She's nought but th' old husk, and thee's slipped away from her like the ripe nut.
"Well, mother," said Adam, "I'll go and tell the captain as it hurts thy feelings for me to stay, and I'd rather go home upon that account. He won't take it ill then, I dare say, and I'm willing." He said this with some effort, for he really longed to be near Hetty this evening.
Nay, I wonna ha thee do that. The young squire'll be angered. Go and do what thee't ordered to do, and me and Seth'll go home. I know it's a grit honour for thee to be so looked on, and who's to be prouder on't nor thy mother? Hadna she the cumber o' rearing thee and doing for thee all these years?
"Well, good-bye then, mother. Good-bye, lad. Remember Gyp when you get home," said Adam, turning away towards the gate of the pleasure grounds, where he hoped he might be able to join the Poysers, for he had been so occupied throughout the afternoon that he had had no time to speak to Hetty. His eye soon detected a distant group, which he knew to be the right one, returning to the house along the broad gravel road, and he hastened on to meet them. "Why, Adam, I'm glad to get sight on you again," said Mr. Poyser, who was carrying Totty on his arm. "You're going to have a bit of fun, I hope, now your work's all done. And here's Hetty has promised no end of partners, and I've just been asking her if she'd agree to dance with you, and she says no." "Well, I didn't think o' dancing to-night," said Adam, already tempted to change his mind as he looked at Hetty. "Nonsense," said Mr. Poyser. "Why, everybody's going to dance to-night, all but the old squire and Mrs. Irwine. Mrs. Best's been telling us as Miss Liddy and Miss Irwine will dance, and the young squire'll pick my wife for his first partner to open the ball, so she'll be forced to dance, though she's laid by ever sin' the Christmas before the little un was born. You canna for shame stand still, Adam, and you a fine young fellow and can dance as well as anybody."
Nay, said Mrs. Poyser, it'd be unbecoming. I know the dancing's nonsense, but if you stick at everything because it's nonsense, you want to go far in this life. When your broth's ready made for you, you mun swallow the thickening, or else let the broth alone.
"Then if Hetty'll dance with me," said Adam, yielding either to Mrs. Poyser's argument or to something else, "I'll dance whichever dance she's free."
"I've got no partner for the fourth dance," said Hetty. "I'll dance that with you if you like."
"Ah," said Mr. Poyser, "but you mun dance the first dance, Adam, else it'll look particular. There's plenty o' nice partners to pick and choose from, and it's hard for the gells when the men stand by and don't ask 'em." Adam felt the justice of Mr. Poyser's observation. It would not do for him to dance with no one besides Hetty, and remembering that Jonathan Berg had some reason to feel hurt to-day, he resolved to ask Miss Mary to dance with him the first dance, if she had no other partner. "There's the big clock striking 8," said Mr. Poyser. "We must make haste in now, else the squire and the ladies'll be in afore us, and that wouldna look well." When they had entered the hall, and the 3 children under Molly's charge had been seated on the stairs, the folding doors of the drawing-room were thrown open, and Arthur entered in his regimentals, leading Mrs. Irwine to a carpet-covered dais ornamented with hothouse plants, where she and Miss Anne were to be seated with old Mr. Donnithorne, that they might look on at the dancing, like the kings and queens in the plays. Arthur had put on his uniform to please the tenants, he said, who thought as much of his militia dignity as if it had been an elevation to the premiership. He had not the least objection to gratify them in that way. His uniform was very advantageous to his figure. The old squire, before sitting down, walked around the hall to greet the tenants and make polite speeches to the wives. He was always polite, but the farmers had found out, after long puzzling, that this polish was one of the signs of hardness. It was observed that he gave his most elaborate civility to Mrs. Poyser tonight, inquiring particularly about her health, recommending her to strengthen herself with cold water, as he did, and avoid all drugs. Mrs. Poyser curtsied and thanked him with great self-command, but when he had passed on, she whispered to her husband, "I'll lay my life he's brewing some nasty turn against us. Old Harry doesn't wag his tail so for nothing." Mr. Poyser had no time to answer, for now Arthur came up and said, "Mrs. Poyser, I've come to request the favour of your hand for the first dance, and Mr. Poyser, you must let me take you to my aunt, for she claims you as her partner." The wife's pale cheek flushed with a nervous sense of unwonted honour, as Arthur led her to the top of the room. But Mr. Poyser, to whom an extra glass had restored his youthful confidence in his good looks and good dancing, walked along with them quite proudly, secretly flattering himself that Miss Lydia had never had a partner in her life who could lift her off the ground as he would. In order to balance the honours given to the two parishes, Miss Irwine danced with Luke Britton, the largest Broxton farmer, and Mr. Gawaine led out Mrs. Britton. Mr. Irwine, after seating his sister Anne, had gone to the Abbey gallery, as he had agreed with Arthur beforehand, to see how the merriment of the cottagers was prospering. Meanwhile, all the less distinguished couples had taken their places. Hetty was led out by the inevitable Mr. Craig, and Mary Berg by Adam. And now the music struck up, and the glorious country dance, best of all dances, began. Pity it was not a boarded floor. Then the rhythmic stamping of the thick shoes would have been better than any drums. That merry stamping, that gracious nodding of the head, that waving bestowal of the hand, where can we see them now? That simple dancing of well-covered matrons, laying aside for an hour the cares of house and dairy, remembering but not affecting youth, not jealous but proud of the young maidens by their side, that holiday sprightliness of portly husbands paying little compliments to their wives, as if courting days were come again, those lads and lasses, a little confused and awkward with their partners, having nothing to say. It would be a pleasant variety to see all that sometimes, instead of low dresses and large skirts, and scanning glances exploring costumes, and languid men in lacquered boots smiling with double meaning. There was but one thing to mar Martin Poyser's pleasure in this dance. It was that he was always in close contact with Luke Britton, that slovenly farmer. He thought of throwing a little glazed coldness into his eye in the crossing of hands, but then, as Miss Irwine was opposite to him instead of the offensive Luke, he might freeze the wrong person. So he gave his face up to hilarity, unchilled by moral judgments. How Hetty's heart beat as Arthur approached her! He had hardly looked at her to-day. Now he must take her hand. Would he press it? Would he look at her? She thought she would cry if he gave her no sign of feeling. Now he was there. He had taken her hand. Yes, he was pressing it. Hetty turned pale as she looked up at him for an instant and met his eyes, before the dance carried him away. That pale look came upon Arthur like the beginning of a dull pain, which clung to him, though he must dance and smile and joke all the same. Hetty would look so when he told her what he had to tell her, and he should never be able to bear it. He should be a fool and give way again. Hetty's look did not really mean so much as he thought. It was only the sign of a struggle between the desire for him to notice her and the dread lest she should betray the desire to others. But Hetty's face had a language that transcended her feelings. There are faces which nature charges with a meaning and a pathos not belonging to the single human soul that flutters beneath them, but speaking the joys and sorrows of foregone generations, eyes that tell of deep love which doubtless has been and is somewhere, but not paired with these eyes, perhaps paired with pale eyes that can say nothing, just as a national language may be instinct with poetry unfelt by the lips that use it. That look of Hetty's oppressed Arthur with a dread which yet had something of a terrible unconfessed delight in it, that she loved him too well. There was a hard task before him, for at that moment he felt he would have given up 3 years of his youth for the happiness of abandoning himself without remorse to his passion for Hetty. These were the incongruous thoughts in his mind as he led Mrs. Poyser, who was panting with fatigue, and secretly resolved that neither judge nor jury should force her to dance another dance, to take a quiet rest in the dining-room, where supper was laid out for the guests to come and take it as they chose.
"I've desired Hetty to remember as she's got to dance with you, sir," said the good innocent woman, "for she's so thoughtless she'd be like enough to go and engage herself for ivery dance. So I told her not to promise too many."
"Thank you, Mrs. Poyser," said Arthur, not without a twinge. "Now sit down in this comfortable chair, and here is Mills ready to give you what you would like best." He hurried away to seek another matronly partner, for due honor must be paid to the married women before he asked any of the young ones, and the country dances, and the stamping, and the gracious nodding, and the waving of the hands went on joyously. At last the time had come for the 4th dance, longed for by the strong, grave Adam, as if he had been a delicate-handed youth of 18, for we are all very much alike when we are in our first love, and Adam had hardly ever touched Hetty's hand for more than a transient greeting, had never danced with her but once before. His eyes had followed her eagerly to-night in spite of himself, and had taken in deeper draughts of love. He thought she behaved so prettily, so quietly. She did not seem to be flirting at all. She smiled less than usual. There was almost a sweet sadness about her. "God bless her," he said inwardly. "I'd make her life a happy un if a strong arm to work for her and a heart to love her could do it." And then there stole over him delicious thoughts of coming home from work and drawing Hetty to his side and feeling her cheek softly pressed against his, till he forgot where he was, and the music and the tread of feet might have been the falling of rain and the roaring of the wind, for what he knew. But now the 3rd dance was ended, and he might go up to her and claim her hand. She was at the far end of the hall, near the staircase, whispering with Molly, who had just given the sleeping Totty into her arms before running to fetch shawls and bonnets from the landing. Mrs. Poyser had taken the 2 boys away into the dining-room to give them some cake before they went home in the cart with grandfather, and Molly was to follow as fast as possible. "Let me hold her," said Adam, as Molly turned upstairs. "The children are so heavy when they're asleep." Hetty was glad of the relief, for to hold Trotty in her arms, standing, was not at all a pleasant variety to her. But this second transfer had the unfortunate effect of rousing Totty, who was not behind any child of her age in peevishness at an unseasonable wakening. While Hetty was in the act of placing her in Adam's arms, and had not yet withdrawn her own, Totty opened her eyes, and forthwith fought out with her left fist at Adam's arm, and with her right caught at the string of brown beads round Hetty's neck. The locket leaped out from her frock, and the next moment the string was broken, and Hetty, helpless, saw beads and locket scattered wide on the floor. "My locket, my locket!" she said in a loud, frightened whisper to Adam. "Never mind the beads." Adam had already seen where the locket fell, for it had attracted his glance as it leaped out of her frock. It had fallen on the raised wooden dais where the band sat, not on the stone floor, and as Adam picked it up he saw the glass with the dark and light locks of hair under it. It had fallen that side upwards, so the glass was not broken. He turned it over in his hand and saw the enamelled gold back. "It isn't hurt," he said as he held it towards Hetty, who was unable to take it because both her hands were occupied with Totty. "Oh, it doesn't matter. I don't mind about it," said Hetty, who had been pale and was now red. "No matter," said Adam gravely. "You seemed very frightened about it. I'll hold it till you're ready to take it," he added, quietly closing his hand over it, that she might not think he wanted to look at it again. By this time Molly had come with bonnet and shawl, and as soon as she had taken Totty, Adam placed the locket in Hetty's hand. She took it with an air of indifference and put it in her pocket, in her heart vexed and angry with Adam because he had seen it, but determined now that she would show no more signs of agitation. "See," she said, "they're taking their places to dance. Let us go." Adam assented silently. A puzzled alarm had taken possession of him. Had Hetty a lover he didn't know of? For none of her relations, he was sure, would give her a locket like that, and none of her admirers with whom he was acquainted was in the position of an accepted lover, as the giver of that locket must be. Adam was lost in the utter impossibility of finding any person for his fears to alight on. He could only feel with a terrible pang that there was something in Hetty's life unknown to him, that while he had been rocking himself in the hope that she would come to love him, she was already loving another. The pleasure of the dance with Hetty was gone. His eyes, when they rested on her, had an uneasy questioning expression in them. He could think of nothing to say to her, and she too was out of temper and disinclined to speak. They were both glad when the dance was ended. Adam was determined to stay no longer. No one wanted him, and no one would notice if he slipped away. As soon as he got out of doors, he began to walk at his habitual rapid pace, hurrying along without knowing why, busy with the painful thought that the memory of this day, so full of honour and promise to him, was poisoned for ever. Suddenly, when he was far on through the chase, he stopped, startled by a flash of reviving hope. After all, he might be a fool, making a great misery out of a trifle. Hetty, fond of finery as she was, might have bought the thing herself. It looked too expensive for that. It looked like the thing on white satin in the great jeweller's shop at Rosseter. But Adam had very imperfect notions of the value of such things, and he thought it could certainly not cost more than a guinea. Perhaps Hetty had as much as that in Christmas boxes, and there was no knowing but she might have been childish enough to spend it in that way. She was such a young thing, and she couldn't help loving finery. But then why had she been so frightened about it at first, and changed colour so, and afterwards pretended not to care? Oh, that was because she was ashamed of his seeing that she had such a smart thing. She was conscious that it was wrong for her to spend her money on it, and she knew that Adam disapproved of finery. It was a proof she cared about what he liked and disliked. She must have thought from his silence and gravity afterwards that he was very much displeased with her, that he was inclined to be harsh and severe towards her foibles. And as he walked on more quietly, chewing the cud of this new hope, his only uneasiness was that he had behaved in a way which might chill Hetty's feeling toward him. For this last view of the matter must be the true one. How could Hetty have an accepted lover quite unknown to him? She was never away from her uncle's house for more than a day. She could have no acquaintances that did not come there, and no intimacies unknown to her uncle and aunt. It would be folly to believe that the locket was given to her by a lover. The little ring of dark hair he felt sure was her own. He could form no guess about the light hair under it, for he had not seen it very distinctly. It might be a bit of her father's or mother's, who had died when she was a child, and she would naturally put a bit of her own along with it. And so Adam went to bed comforted, having woven for himself an ingenious web of probabilities, the surest screen a wise man can place between himself and the truth. His last waking thoughts melted into a dream that he was with Hetty again at the Hall Farm, and that he was asking her to forgive him for being so cold and silent. And while he was dreaming this, Arthur was leading Hetty to the dance, and saying to her in low, hurried tones, "I shall be in the wood the day after tomorrow at 7. Come as early as you can." And Hetty's foolish joys and hopes, which had flown away for a little space, scared by a mere nothing, now all came fluttering back, unconscious of the real peril. She was happy for the first time this long day, and wished that dance would last for hours. Arthur wished it too. It was the last weakness he meant to indulge in, and a man never lies with more delicious languor under the influence of a passion than when he has persuaded himself that he shall subdue it tomorrow. But Mrs. Poyser's wishes were quite the reverse of this, for her mind was filled with dreary forebodings as to the retardation of tomorrow morning's cheese in consequence of these late hours. Now that Hetty had done her duty and danced one dance with the young squire, Mrs. Poyser must go out and see if the cart was come back to fetch them, for it was 10:30 o'clock, and notwithstanding a mild suggestion on his part that it would be bad manners for them to be the first to go, Mrs. Poyser was resolute on the point, manners or no manners. "What, going already, Mrs. Poyser?" said old Mr. Donnithorne, as she came to curtsy and take leave. "I thought we should not part with any of our guests till 11. Mrs. Irwine and I, who are elderly people, think of sitting out the dance till then." "Oh, your honor, it's all right and proper for gentlefolks to stay up by candlelight. They've got no cheese on their minds. We're late enough as it is, and there's no letting the cows know as they mustn't want to be milked so early tomorrow morning. So if you'll please to excuse us, we'll take our leave." She said to her husband as they set off in the cart, "I'd sooner have brewing the day and washing today together than one of these pleasuring days. There's no work so tiring as dangling about and staring and not rightly knowing what you're going to do next, and keeping your face in smiling order like a grocer on market day for fear people should think you civil enough. And you've nothing to show for it when it's done, if it isn't a yellow face with eating things as disagree." "Nay, nay," said Mr. Poyser, who was in his merriest mood, and felt that he had had a great day. "A bit o' pleasuring's good for thee sometimes, and thee danced as well as any of 'em, for I'll back thee against all the wives in the parish for a light foot and ankle. And it was a great honour for the young squire to ask thee first. I reckon it was because I sat at the head of the table and made the speech. And Hetty too, she never had such a partner before, a fine young gentleman in regimentals. It'll serve you to talk on, Hetty, when you're an old woman, how you danced with the young squire the day he come o' age." End of chapter 26 of Book 3, The Dance. Adam Bede, by George Eliot. Recording by Father Zeile of Detroit, Michigan. drzeile.net, drzeile.net.
7 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede, by George Eliot. Chapter 27. A Crisis. It was beyond the middle of August, nearly 3 weeks after the birthday feast. The reaping of the wheat had begun in our North Midland county of Loamshire, but the harvest was likely still to be retarded by the heavy rains, which were causing inundations and much damage throughout the country. From this last trouble, the Broxton and Hayslope farmers, on their pleasant uplands and in their brook-watered valleys, had not suffered, and as I cannot pretend that they were such exceptional farmers as to love the general good better than their own, you will infer that they were not in very low spirits about the rapid rise in the price of bread, so long as there was hope of gathering in their own corn undamaged, and occasional days of sunshine and drying winds flattered this hope. The 18th of August was one of these days when the sunshine looked brighter in all eyes, for for the gloom that went before. Grand masses of cloud were hurried across the blue, and the great round hills behind the Chase seemed alive with their flying shadows. The sun was hidden for a moment, and then shone out warm again like a recovered joy. The leaves, still green, were tossed off the hedgerow trees by the wind. Around the farmhouses there was a sound of clapping doors. The apples fell in the orchards, and the stray horses on the green sides of the lanes and on the common had their manes blown about their faces. And yet the wind seemed only part of the general gladness because the sun was shining. A merry day for the children, who ran and shouted to see if they could top the wind with their voices, and the grown-up people too were in good spirits, inclined to believe in yet finer days, when the wind had fallen. If only the corn were not ripe enough to be blown out of the husk and scattered as untimely seed. And yet a day on which a blighting sorrow may fall upon a man. For if it be true that nature at certain moments seems charged with a presentiment of one individual lot, must it not also be true that she seems unmindful and conscious of another? For there is no hour that has not its births of gladness and despair, no morning brightness that does not bring new sickness to desolation, as well as new forces to genius and love. There are so many of us, and our lots are so different. What wonder that nature's mood is often in harsh contrast with the great crisis of our lives? We are children of a large family, and must learn, as such children do, not to expect that our hurts will be made much of, to be content with little nurture and caressing, and help each other the more. It was a busy day with Adam, who of late had done almost double work, for he was continuing to act as foreman for Jonathan Burge, until some satisfactory person could be found to supply his piece, and Jonathan was slow to find that person. But he had done the extra work cheerfully, for his hopes were buoyant again about Hedy. Every time she had seen him since the birthday, she had seemed to make an effort to behave all the more kindly to him, that she might make him understand she had forgiven his silence and coldness during the dance. He had never mentioned the locket to her again, too happy that she smiled at him, still happier because he observed in her a more subdued air, something that he interpreted as the growth of womanly tenderness and seriousness. Ah, he thought, again and again, she's only 17. She'll be thoughtful enough after a while. And her aunt always says how clever she is at the work. She'll make a wife his mother will have no occasion to grumble at after all. To be sure, he had only seen her at home twice since the birthday. For one Sunday, when he was intending to go from church to the Hall Farm, Hetty had joined the party of upper servants from the Chase and had gone home with them, almost as if she were inclined to encourage Mr. Craig. "She's taking too much liking to them folks in the housekeeper's room," Mrs. Poyser remarked. "For my part, I was never over fond of gentlefolks as servants. They're mostly like the fine ladies' fat dogs, neither good for barking nor butcher's meat, but only for show." And another evening she was gone to Treddleston to buy some things, though to his great surprise, as he was returning home, he saw her at a distance getting over a stile quite out of the Treddleston road. But when he hastened to her she was very kind, and asked him to go in again when he had taken her to the yard gate. She had gone a little farther into the fields after coming from Treddleston, because she didn't want to go in, she said. It was so nice to be out of doors, and her aunt always made such a fuss about it if she wanted to go out. "Oh, do come in with me," she said, as he was going to shake hands with her at the gate, and he could not resist that. So he went in, and Mrs. Poyser was contented with only a slight remark on Hetty's being later than was expected, while Hedy, who had looked out of spirits when he met her, smiled and talked and waited on them all with unusual promptitude. That was the last time he had seen her, but he meant to make leisure for going to the farm tomorrow. Today, he knew, was her day for going to the Chase to sew with the lady's maid, so he would get as much work done as possible this evening, that the next might be clear. One piece of work that Adam was superintending was some slight repairs at the Chase farm, which had been hitherto occupied by Satchel as bailiff, but which it was now rumoured that the old squire was going to let to a smart man in top boots, who had been seen to ride over it one day. Nothing but the desire to get a tenant could account for the squire's undertaking repairs, though the Saturday evening party at Mr. Casson's agreed over their pipes that no man in his senses would take the Chase farm unless there was a bit more ploughland laid to it. However that might be, the repairs were ordered to be executed with all dispatch, and Adam, acting for Mr. Burge, was carrying out the order with his usual energy. But to-day, having been occupied elsewhere, he had not been able to arrive at the Chase farm till late in the afternoon, and he then discovered that some old roofing, which he had calculated on preserving, had given way. There was clearly no good to be done with this part of the building without pulling it all down, and Adam immediately saw in his mind a plan for building it up again, so as to make the most convenient of cowsheds and calf pens, with a hovel for implements, and all without any great expense for materials. So, when the workmen were gone, he sat down, took out his pocket-book, and busied himself with sketching a plan, and making a specification of the expenses, that he might show it to Birch the next morning, and set him on persuading the squire to consent. To make a good job of anything, however small, was always a pleasure to Adam, and he sat on a block, with his book resting on a planning table, whistling low every now and then, and turning his head on one side with a just perceptible smile of gratification. Of pride, too, for if Adam loved a bit of good work, he loved also to think, "I did it." And I believe the only people who are free from that weakness are those who have no work to call their own. It was nearly 7 before he had finished and put on his jacket again, and on giving a last look round he observed that Seth, who had been working here to-day, had left his basket of tools behind him. "Why, the lad's forgot his tools," thought Adam, "and he's got to work up at the shop to-morrow. There never was such a chap for wool gathering. He'd leave his head behind him if it was loose. However, it's lucky I've seen him. I'll carry him home." The buildings of the Chase farm lay at one extremity of the Chase, at about 10 minutes' walking distance from the Abbey. Adam had come thither on his pony, intending to ride to the stables, and put up his nag on his way home. At the stables he encountered Mr. Craig, who had come to look at the captain's new horse, on which he was to ride away the day after tomorrow, and Mr. Craig detained him to tell how all the servants were to collect at the gate of the courtyard to wish the young squire luck as he rode out, so that by the time Adam had got into the Chase and was striding along with a basket of tools over his shoulder, the sun was on the point of setting, and was sending level crimson rays among the great trunks of the old oaks, and touching every bare patch of ground with a transient glory that made it look like a jewel dropped upon the grass. The wind had fallen now, and there was only enough breeze to stir the delicate stemmed leaves. Any one who had been sitting in the house all day would have been glad to walk now, but Adam had been quite enough in the open air to wish to shorten his way home, and he bethought himself that he might do so by striking across the Chase and going through the grove, where he had never been for years. He hurried on across the Chase, stalking along the narrow paths between the fern, with Gyp at his heels, not lingering to watch the magnificent changes of the light, hardly once thinking it, yet feeling its presence in a certain calm, happy awe which mingled itself with his busy working-day thoughts. How could he help feeling it? The very deer felt it, and were more timid. Presently Adam's thoughts recurred to what Mr. Craig had said about Arthur Donnithorne, and pictured his going away, and the changes that might take place before he came back. Then they travelled back affectionately over the old scenes of boyish companionship, and dwelt on Arthur's good qualities, which Adam had a pride in, as we all have in the virtues of the superior who honours us. A nature like Adam's, with a great need of love and reverence in it, depends for so much of its happiness on what it can believe and feel about others, and he had no ideal world of dead heroes. He knew little of the life of men in the past. He must find the beings to whom he could cling with loving admiration among those who came within speech of him. These pleasant thoughts about Arthur brought a milder expression than usual into his keen rough face. Perhaps they were the reason why, when he opened the old green gate leading into the grove, he paused to pat Gyp and say a kind word to him. After that pause, he strode on again along the broad winding path through the grove. What grand beeches! Adam delighted in a fine tree of all things. As the fisherman's sight is keenest on the sea, so Adam's perceptions were more at home with trees than with other objects. He kept them in his memory as a painter does, with all the flecks and knots in their bark, all the curves and angles of their boughs, and had often calculated the height and contents of a trunk to a nicety, as he stood looking at it. No wonder that, notwithstanding his desire to get on, he could not help pausing to look at a curious large beech which he had seen standing before him at a turning in the road, and convince himself that it was not 2 trees wedded together, but only one. For the rest of his life he remembered that moment when he was calmly examining the beech, as a man remembers his last glimpse of the home where his youth was passed, before the road turned, and he saw it no more. The beech stood at the last turning before the grove ended in an archway of boughs that let in the eastern light, and as Adam stepped away from the tree to continue his walk, his eyes fell on 2 figures about 20 yards before him. He remained as motionless as a statue, and turned almost as pale. The 2 figures were standing opposite to each other, with clasped hands about to part, and while they were bending to kiss, Gyp, who had been running among the brushwood, came out, caught sight of them, and gave a sharp bark. They separated with a start. One hurried through the gate out of the grove, and the other, turning round, walked slowly with a sort of saunter towards Adam, who still stood transfixed and pale, clutching tighter the stick with which he held the basket of tools over his shoulder, and looking at the approaching figure with eyes in which amazement was fast turning to fierceness. Arthur Donnithorne looked flushed and excited. He had tried to make unpleasant feelings more bearable by drinking a little more wine than usual at dinner today, and was still enough under its flattering influence to think more lightly of this unwished-for rencontre with Adam than he would otherwise have done. After all, Adam was the best person who could have happened to see him and Hetty together. He was a sensible fellow, and would not babble about it to other people. Arthur felt confident that he could laugh the thing off and explain it away, and so he sauntered forward with elaborate carelessness, his flushed face, his evening dress of fine cloth and fine linen, his hands half thrust into his waistcoat pockets, all shone upon by the strange evening light which the light clouds had caught up even to the zenith, and were now shedding down between the topmost branches above him. Adam was still motionless, looking at him as he came up. He understood it all now, the locket and everything else that had been doubtful to him. A terrible scorching light showed him the hidden letters that changed the meaning of the past. If he had moved a muscle, he must inevitably have sprung upon Arthur like a tiger, and in the conflicting motions that filled those long moments, he had told himself that he would not give loose to passion, he would only speak the right thing. He stood as if petrified by an unseen force, but the force was his own strong will. "Well, Adam," said Arthur, "you've been looking at the fine old beeches, eh? They're not to be come near by the hatchet, though. This is a sacred grove. I overtook pretty little Hetty Sorrel as I was coming to my den, the hermitage, there. She ought not to come home this way so late, so I took care of her to the gate, and asked for a kiss for my pains. But I must get back now, for this road is confoundedly damp. Good night, Adam. I shall see you tomorrow, to say good-bye, you know." Arthur was too much preoccupied with the part he was playing himself to be thoroughly aware of the expression in Adam's face. He did not look directly at Adam, but glanced carelessly round at the trees, and then lifted up one foot to look at the sole of his boot. He cared to say no more. He had thrown quite dust enough into honest Adam's eyes, and as he spoke the last words he walked on. "Stop a bit, sir," said Adam, in a hard peremptory voice, without turning round. "I've got a word to say to you." Arthur paused in surprise. Susceptible persons are more affected by a change of tone than by unexpected words, and Arthur had the susceptibility of a nature at once affectionate and vain. He was still more surprised when he saw that Adam had not moved, but stood with his back to him, as if summoning him to return. What did he mean? He was going to make a serious business of this affair. Arthur felt his temper rising. A patronizing disposition always has its meaner side, and in the confusion of his irritation and alarm there entered the feeling that a man to whom he had shown so much favour as to Adam was not in a position to criticize his conduct, and yet he was dominated, as one who feels himself in the wrong always is, by the man whose good opinion he cares for. In spite of pride and temper, there was as much deprecation as anger in his voice when he said, "What do you mean, Adam?" "I mean, sir," answered Adam, in the same harsh voice, still without turning round, "I mean, sir, that you don't deceive me by your light words. This is not the first time you've met Hetty Sorrel in this grove, and this is not the first time you've kissed her." Arthur felt a startled uncertainty how far Adam was speaking from knowledge, and how far from mere inference, and this uncertainty, which prevented him from contriving a prudent answer, heightened his irritation. He said, in a harsh, sharp tone, "Well, sir, what then?" "Why, then, instead of acting like the upright, honourable man we've all believed you to be, you've been acting the part of a selfish, light-minded scoundrel. You know as well as I do what it's to lead to when a gentleman like you kisses and makes love to a young woman like Hetty, and gives her presents as she's frightened for other folks to see. And I say it again, you're acting the part of a selfish, light-minded scoundrel, though it cuts me to the heart to say so, and I'd rather have lost my right hand." "Let me tell you, Adam," said Arthur, bridling his growing anger and trying to recur to his careless tone, "you're not only devilishly impertinent, but you're talking nonsense. Every pretty girl is not such a fool as you to suppose that when a gentleman admires her beauty and pays her a little attention, he must mean something particular. Every man likes to flirt with a pretty girl, and every pretty girl likes to be flirted with. The wider the distance between them, the less harm there is, for then she's not likely to deceive herself." "I don't know what you mean by flirting," said Adam, "but if you mean behaving to a woman as if you have loved her, and yet not loving her all the while, I say that's not the action of an honest man, and what isn't honest does come to harm. I'm not a fool, and you're not a fool, and you know better than what you're saying. You know it couldn't be made public as you've behaved to Hetty as you've done, without her losing her character and bringing shame and trouble on her and her relations. What if you meant nothing by your kissing in your presence? Other folks won't believe as you've meant nothing. And don't tell me about her not deceiving herself. I tell you as you've filled her mind so with the thought of you, and that'll mayhap poison her life, and she'd never love another man as 'ud make her a good husband." Arthur had felt a sudden relief while Adam was speaking. He perceived that Adam had no positive knowledge of the past, and that there was no irrevocable damage done by this evening's unfortunate rencontre. Adam could still be deceived. The candid Arthur had brought himself into a position in which successful lying was his only hope. The hope allayed his anger a little. "Well, Adam," he said in a tone of friendly concession, "you're perhaps right. Perhaps I've gone a little too far in taking notice of the pretty little thing and stealing a kiss now and then. You're such a grave, steady fellow. You don't understand the temptation to such trifling. I'm sure I wouldn't bring any trouble or annoyance on her and the good Poysers on any account if I could help it. But I think you look a little too seriously at it. You know I'm going away immediately, so I shan't make any more mistakes of the kind. But let us say good night." Arthur here turned round to walk on, "and talk no more about the matter. The whole thing will soon be forgotten." "No, by God!" Adam burst out with rage that could be controlled no longer, throwing down the basket of tools and striding forward till he was right in front of Arthur. All his jealousy and sense of personal injury, which he had been hitherto trying to keep under, had leaped up and mastered him. What man of us, in the first moments of a sharp agony, could ever feel that the fellow man who has been the medium of inflicting it did not mean to hurt us? In our instinctive rebellion against pain, we are children again, and demand an active will to wreak our vengeance on. Adam at this moment could only feel that he had been robbed of Hedy, robbed treacherously by the man in whom he had trusted, and he stood close in front of Arthur, with fierce eyes glaring at him, with pale lips and clenched hands, the hard tones in which he had hitherto been constraining himself to express no more than a just indignation, giving way to a deep agitated voice that seemed to shake him as he spoke. "No, it'll not be soon forgot, as you've come in between her and me, when she might have loved me. It'll not soon be forgot as you've robbed me of my happiness, while I thought you was my best friend and a noble-minded man, as I was proud to work for. And you've been kissing her and meaning nothing, have you? And I've never kissed her in my life, but I'd have worked hard for years for the right to kiss her, and you make light of it. You think little of doing what may damage other folks, so as you get your bit of trifling, as means nothing. I throw back your favours, for you're not the man I took you for. I'll never count you my friend any more. I'd rather you'd act as my enemy, and fight me where I stand. It's all the amends you can make me." Poor Adam, possessed by rage that could find no other vent, began to throw off his coat and his cap, too blind with passion to notice the change that had taken place in Arthur while he was speaking. Arthur's lips were now as pale as Adam's. His heart was beating violently. The discovery that Adam loved Hedy was a shock which made him for the moment see himself in the light of Adam's indignation, and regard Adam's suffering as not merely a consequence, but an element of his error. The words of hatred and contempt, the first he had ever heard in his life, seemed like scorching missiles that were making ineffaceable scars on him. All screening self-excuse, which rarely falls quite away while others respect us, forsook him for an instant, and he stood face to face with the first great irrevocable evil he had ever committed. He was only 21, and 3 months ago, nay, much later, he had thought proudly that no man should ever be able to reproach him justly. His first impulse, if there had been time for it, would perhaps have been to utter words of propitiation. But Adam had no sooner thrown off his coat and cap than he became aware that Arthur was standing pale and motionless, with his hands still thrust in his waistcoat pockets. "What?" he said. "Won't you fight me like a man? You know I won't strike you while you stand so." "Go away, Adam," said Arthur. "I don't want to fight you." "No," said Adam bitterly. "You don't want to fight me? You think I'm a common man as you can injure without answering for it." "I never meant to injure you," said Arthur, with returning anger. "I didn't know you loved her." "But you've made her love you," said Adam. "You're a double-faced man. I'll never believe a word you say again." "Go away, I tell you," said Arthur angrily, "or we shall both repent." "No," said Adam with a convulsed voice. "I swear I won't go away without fighting you. Do you want provoking any more? I tell you you're a coward and a scoundrel, and I despise you." The colour had all rushed back to Arthur's face. In a moment his right hand was clenched, and dealt a blow like lightning, which sent Adam staggering backward. His blood was as thoroughly up as Adam's now, and the two men, forgetting the emotions that had gone before, fought with the instinctive fierceness of panthers in the deepening twilight darkened by the trees. The delicate-handed gentleman was a match for the workman in everything but strength, and Arthur's skill enabled him to protract the struggle for some long moments, But between unarmed men the battle is to the strong, where the strong is no blunderer, and Arthur must sink under a well-planted blow of Adam's as a steel rod is broken by an iron bar. The blow soon came, and Arthur fell, his head lying concealed in a tuft of fern, so that Adam could only discern his darkly clad body. He stood still in the dim light, waiting for Arthur to rise. The blow had been given now, towards which he had been straining all the force of nerve and muscle. And what was the good of it? What had he done by fighting? Only satisfied his own passion, only wreaked his own vengeance. He had not rescued Hedy, nor changed the past. There it was, just as it had been, and he sickened at the vanity of his own rage. But why did not Arthur rise? It was perfectly motionless, and the time seemed long to Adam. Good God, had the blow been too much for him? Adam shuddered at the thought of his own strength, as with the oncoming of this dread he knelt down by Arthur's side and lifted his head from among the fern. There was no sign of life. The eyes and teeth were set. The horror that rushed over Adam completely mastered him and forced upon him its own belief. He could feel nothing but that death was in Arthur's face, and that he was helpless before it. He made not a single movement, but knelt like an image of despair gazing at an image of death. End of chapter 17. Of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 28. A Dilemma. It was only a few minutes measured by the clock, though Adam always thought it had been a long while, before he perceived a gleam of consciousness in Arthur's face and a slight shiver through his frame. The intense joy that flooded his soul brought back some of the old affection with it. "Do you feel any pain, sir?" he said tenderly, loosening Arthur's cravat. Arthur turned his eyes on Adam with a vague stare which gave way to a slightly startled motion, as if from the shock of returning memory, but he only shivered again and said nothing. "Do you feel any hurt, sir?" Adam said again, with a trembling in his voice. Arthur put his hand up to his waistcoat buttons, and when Adam had unbuttoned it, he took a longer breath. "Lay my head down," he said faintly, "and get me some water if you can." Adam laid the head down gently on the fern again, and emptying the tools out of the flag basket, hurried through the trees to the edge of the grove bordering on the chase, where a brook ran below the bank. When he returned with his basket leaking, but still half full, Arthur looked at him with a more thoroughly reawakened consciousness. "Can you drink a drop out of your hand, sir?" said Adam, kneeling down again to lift up Arthur's head. "No," said Arthur. "Dip my cravat in and souse it on my head." The water seemed to do him some good, for he presently raised himself a little higher, resting on Adam's arm. "Do you feel any hurt inside, sir?" Adam asked again. "No, no hurt," said Arthur, still faintly, "but rather done up." After a while he said, "I suppose I fainted away when you knocked me down." "Yes, sir, thank God," said Adam. "I thought it was worse." "What? You thought you'd done me for, eh? Come help me on my legs." "I feel terribly shaky and dizzy," Arthur said, as he stood leaning on Adam's arm. "That blow of yours must have come against me like a battering ram. I don't believe I can walk alone." "Lean on me, sir. I'll get you along," said Adam. "Or will you sit down a bit longer on my coat here, and I'll prop you up? You'll perhaps be better in a minute or two." "No," said Arthur. "I'll go to the Hermitage. I think I've got some brandy there. There's a short road to it a little farther on near the gate, if you'll just help me on." They walked slowly, with frequent pauses, but without speaking again. In both of them, the concentration in the present which had attended the first moments of Arthur's revival had now given way to a vivid recollection of the previous scene. It was nearly dark in the narrow path among the trees, but within the circle of fir trees round the Hermitage there was room for the glowing moonlight to enter in at the windows. Their steps were noiseless on the thick carpet of fern needles, and the outward stillness seemed to heighten their inward consciousness, as Arthur took the key out of his pocket and placed it in Adam's hand for him to open the door. Adam had not known before that Arthur had furnished the old Hermitage and made it a retreat for himself, and it was a surprise to him when he opened the door to see a snug room with all the signs of frequent habitation. Arthur loosed Adam's arm and threw himself on the ottoman. "You'll see my hunting bottle somewhere," he said, "a leather case with a bottle and glass in." Adam was not long in finding the case. "There's a very little brandy in it, sir," he said, turning it downwards over the glass as he held it before the window. "Hardly this little glassful." "Well, give me that," said Arthur, with the peevishness of physical depression. When he had taken some sips, Adam said, "Hadn't I better run to the house, sir, and get some more brandy? I can be there and back pretty soon. It'll be a stiff walk home for you if you don't have something to revive you." "Yes, go, but don't say I'm ill. Ask for my man Pym, and tell him to get it from Mills, and not to say I'm at the Hermitage. Get some water, too." Adam was relieved to have an active task. Both of them were relieved to be apart from each other for a short time. But Adam's swift pace could not still the eager pain of thinking, of living again with concentrated suffering through the last wretched hour, and looking out from it over all the new sad future. Arthur lay still for some minutes after Adam was gone, but presently he rose feebly from the ottoman and peered about slowly in the broken moonlight, seeking something. It was a short bit of wax candle that stood amongst a confusion of writing and drawing materials. There was more searching for the means of lighting the candle, and when that was done, he went cautiously round the room, as if wishing to assure himself of the presence of absence of something. At last he had found a slight thing, which he put first in his pocket, and then, on a second thought, took out again and thrust deep down into a waste-paper basket. It was a woman's little pink silk neckerchief. He set the candle on the table and threw himself down on the ottoman again, exhausted with the effort. When Adam came back with his supplies, his entrance awoke Arthur from a doze. "That's right," Arthur said. "I'm tremendously in want of some brandy vigour." "I'm glad to see you've got a light, sir," said Adam. "I've been thinking I'd better have asked for a lanthorn." "No, no, the candle will last long enough. I shall soon be up to walking home now." "I can't go before I've seen you safe home, sir," said Adam hesitatingly. "No, it will be better for you to stay. Sit down." Adam sat down, and they remained opposite to each other in uneasy silence, while Arthur slowly drank brandy and water, with visibly renovating effect. He began to lie in a more voluntary position, and looked as if he were less overpowered by bodily sensations. Adam was keenly alive to these indications, and as his anxiety about Arthur's condition began to be allayed, he felt more of that impatience which every one knows who has had his just indignation suspended by the physical state of the culprit. Yet there was one thing on his mind to be done before he could recur to remonstrance. It was to confess what had been unjust in his own words. Perhaps he longed all the more to make this confession, that his indignation might be free again, and as he saw the signs of returning ease in Arthur, the words again and again came to his lips and went back, checked by the thought that it would be better to leave everything till tomorrow. As long as they were silent, they did not look at each other, and a foreboding came across Adam that if they began to speak as though they remembered the past, if they looked at each other with full recognition, they must take fire again. So they sat in silence till the bit of wax candle flickered low in the socket, the silence all the while becoming more irksome to Adam. Arthur had just poured out some more brandy and water, and he threw one arm behind his head and drew up one leg in an attitude of recovered ease, which was an irresistible temptation to Adam to speak what was on his mind. "You begin to feel more yourself again, sir," he said, as the candle went out and they were half hidden from each other in the faint moonlight. "Yes. I don't feel good for much, very lazy, and not inclined to move. But I'll go home when I've taken this dose." There was a slight pause before Adam said, "My temper got the better of me, and I said things as wasn't true. I'd no right to speak as if you'd known you was doing me an injury. You'd no grounds for knowing it. I've always kept what I felt for her as secret as I could." He paused again before he went on. "And perhaps I judged you too harsh. I'm apt to be harsh, and you may have acted out of thoughtlessness more than I should have believed it was possible for a man with a heart and a conscience. We're not all put together alike, and we may misjudge one another. God knows it's all the joy I could have now to think the best of you." Arthur wanted to go home without saying any more. He was too painfully embarrassed in mind, as well as too weak in body, to wish for any further explanation tonight, and yet it was a relief to him that Adam reopened the subject in a way the least difficult for him to answer. Arthur was in the wretched position of an open, generous man who has committed an error which makes deception seem a necessity. The native impulse to give truth in return for truth, to meet trust with frank confession, must be suppressed, and duty was becoming a question of tactics. His deed was reacting upon him, was already governing him tyrannously, and forcing him into a course that jarred with his habitual feelings. The only aim that seemed admissible to him now was to deceive Adam to the utmost, to make Adam think better of him than he deserved. And when he heard the words of honest retraction, when he heard the sad appeal with which Adam had ended, he was obliged to rejoice in the remains of ignorant confidence it implied. He did not answer immediately, for he had to be judicious and not truthful. "Say no more about our anger, Adam," he said at last, very languidly, for the labour of speech was unwelcome to him. "I forgive your momentary injustice. It was quite natural, with the exaggerated notions you had in your mind. We shall be none the worse friends in future, I hope, because we fought. You had the best of it, and that was as it should be, for I believe I've been most in the wrong of the two. Come, let us shake hands." Arthur held out his hand, but Adam sat still. "I don't like to say no to that, sir," he said, "but I can't shake hands till it's clear what we mean by it. I was wrong when I spoke as if you'd done me an injury knowingly, but I wasn't wrong in what I said before about your behaviour to Hedy, and I can't shake hands with you as if I held you my friend the same as ever till you've cleared that up better." Arthur swallowed his pride and resentment as he drew back his hand. He was silent for some moments, and then said, as indifferently as he could, "I don't know what you mean by clearing up, Adam. I've told you already that you think too seriously of a little flirtation. But if you are right in supposing there is any danger in it, I'm going away on Saturday, and there will be an end of it. As for the pain it has given you, I'm heartily sorry for it. I can say no more." Adam said nothing, but rose from his chair and stood with his face towards one of the windows, as if looking at the blackness of the moonlit fir-trees. But he was in reality conscious of nothing but the conflict within him. It was of no use now, his resolution not to speak till tomorrow. He must speak there and then, but it was several minutes before he turned round and stepped nearer to Arthur, standing and looking down on him as he lay. "It'll be better for me to speak plain," he said, with evident effort, "though it's hard work. You see, sir, this isn't a trifle to me, whatever it may be to you. I'm none of the men as can go making love first to one woman and then to another, and don't think it much odds whichever I take. What I feel for Hedy's a different sort o' love, such as I believe nobody can know much about but them as feel it and God as has given it to 'em. She's more nor everything else to me, all but my conscience and my good name. And if it's true what you've been saying all along, and if it's only been trifling and flirting as you call it, as'll be put an end to by your going away, why then I'd wait and hope her heart 'ud turn to me after all. I'm loath to think you'd speak false to me, and I'll believe your word, however things may look." "You would be wronging Hedy more than me not to believe it," said Arthur, almost violently, starting up from the ottoman and moving away. But he threw himself into a chair again directly, saying more feebly, "You seem to forget that, in suspecting me, you are casting imputations upon her." "Nay, sir," Adam said in a calmer voice, as if he were half relieved, for he was too straightforward to make a distinction between a direct falsehood and an indirect one. "Nay, sir, things don't lie level between Hedy and you. You're acting with your eyes open, whatever you may do. But how do you know what's been in her mind? She's all but a child, as any man with a conscience in him ought to feel bound to take care on. And whatever you may think, I know you've disturbed her mind. I know she's been fixing her heart on you, for there's a many things clear to me now as I didn't understand before. But you seem to make light of what she may feel. You don't think of that." "Good God, Adam, let me alone!" Arthur burst out impetuously. "I feel it enough without your worrying me." He was aware of his indiscretion as soon as the words had escaped him. "Well, then, if you feel it," Adam rejoined eagerly, "if you feel as you may have put false notions into her mind, and made her believe as you loved her, when all the while you meant nothing, I've this demand to make of you. I'm not speaking for myself, but for her. I ask you to undeceive her before you go away. You aren't going away for ever, and if you leave her behind with a notion in her head of your feelings about her the same as she feels about you, she'll be hankering after you, and the mischief may get worse. It may be a smart to her now, but it'll save her pain at the end. I ask you to write a letter. You may trust to my seeing as she gets it. Tell her the truth, and take blame to yourself for behaving as you'd no right to do to a young woman who isn't your equal. I speak plain, sir, but I can't speak any other way. There's nobody can take care of Hedy in this thing but me." "I can do what I think needful in the matter," said Arthur, more and more irritated by mingled distress and perplexity, "without giving promises to you. I shall take what measures I think proper." "No," said Adam, in an abrupt, decided tone, "that won't do. I must know what ground I'm treading on. I must be safe as you've put an end to what ought never to have been begun. I don't forget what's owing to you as a gentleman, but in this thing we're man and man, and I can't give up." There was no answer for some moments. Then Arthur said, "I'll see you tomorrow. I can bear no more now. I'm ill." He rose as he spoke, and reached his cap as if intending to go. "You won't see her again!" Adam exclaimed, with a flash of recurring anger and suspicion, moving towards the door and placing his back against it. "Either tell me she can never be my wife, tell me you've been lying, or else promise me what I've said." Adam, uttering this alternative, stood like a terrible fate before Arthur, who had moved forward a step or two, and now stopped, faint, shaken, sick in mind and body. It seemed long to both of them, that inward struggle of Arthur's, before he said feebly, "I promise. Let me go." Adam moved away from the door and opened it, but when Arthur reached the step, he stopped again and leaned against the door-post. "You're not well enough to walk alone, sir," said Adam. "Take my arm again." Arthur made no answer, and presently walked on, Adam following. But after a few steps he stood still again and said coldly, "I believe I must trouble you. It's getting late now, and there may be an alarm set up about me at home." Adam gave his arm, and they walked on without uttering a word, till they came where the basket and the tools lay. "I must pick up the tools, sir," Adam said. "They're my brother's. I doubt they'll be rusted, if you'll please to wait a minute." Arthur stood still without speaking, and no other word passed between them till they were at the side entrance, where he hoped to get in without being seen by any one. He said then, "Thank you. I needn't trouble you any further." "What time will it be convenient for me to see you tomorrow, sir?" said Adam. "You may send me word that you're here at 5 o'clock," said Arthur. "Not before." "Good night, sir," said Adam, but he heard no reply. Arthur had turned into the house. End of chapter 28.